Hello and welcome everyone to episode 6 of the Saturdays Are for the Byzantines podcast. I'm your host, Professor Wren. Disclaimer, obviously not an actual college professor. I don't work for any university in the United States, which is where I'm from, or anywhere else in the world for that matter. Just the title indicates that, we're this class taught at a university, which is really basically the only place where you can study Byzantine history, unless you're at some sort of unicorn school, like high school in the United States, where the history curriculum entails anything other than U.S. history with like a year of world history or something like that. You're probably not going to find anything like this material unless you were to go to college. And even those who go to college, even those who study history in college, probably not studying Byzantine history. My own experience in, obviously I was a history major in college, and most of the other history majors around were not studying this type of thing. I took 2 semesters worth of Byzantine history, really liked it, and so now I kind of bring what I learned to you in this podcast, and kind of the goal in this project that I've started here is to kind of present this sort of it's a podcast series, but I'm really, the way I think about this, it's more of a lecture series, almost like if you were to take Byzantine history as a class in college. But obviously, this you can get for free versus paying however many $100 per credit you would have to pay if you took this in college. It's available for free we're on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Google Play. Make sure to give us a follow or subscribe and a 5-star rating if you're listening to this on any of those platforms. If you're listening on YouTube, please give us a subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another episode. I don't really know why I say we when I talk about the YouTube channel, because I'm the only person here who's doing this. I don't have anyone really helping me out with this. I'm figuring out the technology aspect of this as I go. I do understand that a couple of our episodes are not available on YouTube, even though they're available on like Spotify, for example. Part of that was, just in my getting this project going, trying to figure out how to get it all uploaded to all of the different platforms. Took a while to figure out how to get all that going, but from now on, we should be good. All of the episodes should be on YouTube as well as Spotify and Apple Podcast and Google Play, and maybe we'll expand in the future. Maybe we'll go on to Stitcher or iHeartRadio. I don't know. Does anyone listen to anything on iHeart? I've never talked to anyone who said, I was listening to a podcast on iHeartRadio the other day. But, if you do and there's interest for it, then we can put it on there as well. But I know there was a question about the availability of episodes on YouTube versus other platforms from a listener the other day, so I just wanted to address that in an episode. But anyway, so now we get into the real meat of today's episode, lecture, if you will. And so we're just to recap, we're coming off of the emperor, the reign of Julian the Apostate, who had just died during a disastrous campaign against the Persians. Julian was the Roman emperor who attempted to revert the Romans back to paganism, which did not work out for him. And then he also led a campaign against the Persians, which really also did not work out very well. The campaign did not take any new territory, cost the Romans, valuable time, money, soldiers, resources, and Julian died in the process. So really, not a great moment here for the Roman Empire. And so as the Roman army retreats from Persia back into Roman borders, they need to select a new emperor because obviously there's no emperor. Julian was the only emperor at the time. He did not have an imperial colleague at that point, as a lot of other situations we've talked about here do have, right? There was not an Eastern and a Western emperor at this point. It was only Julian. And so the candidate who's chosen as the next emperor is a guy named Jovian. Now, I'm not going to tell you much about Jovian because he dies about 8 months into his reign, before the army even makes it all the way back to Constantinople. And so they need to select another new emperor. And after eliminating a couple of possibilities, a guy named Valentinian is chosen to be the new emperor, and so he dons the purple. Now, Valentinian has a bit of a checkered history. He is a career soldier, career military man, and the first we kind of hear about him in terms of his military background is that he was a soldier, seemingly lower middle-level officer in the army under the Emperor Julian, actually, when Julian was fighting the Alemanni in the Western Empire. You'll remember Julian was sent to the West to kind of counter this Alemanni raid invasion of the Western Empire, and this is where some of our early information about Valentinian comes from. And it's not really good because what seems to have happened was that the Romans had planned some sort of ambush of a group of Alemanni soldiers, and it didn't go very well. The ambush essentially failed. And what it really looks like is that the officer in charge of this ambush kind of throws Valentinian under the bus and blames him. He basically says that it was Valentinian's fault that the ambush didn't work out. And obviously this was very damaging to Valentinian's career, and he actually kind of goes under the radar for a few years after this. He goes to one of his family's estates, and no one really sees him for some time after this. But nevertheless, Valentinian does manage to get back into the good graces of the military, and he even becomes the commander of several elite military units, such as the Cornudi, Scutari, and Scolae Palatinae, or Palatinae, however you want to pronounce that. But these are all, not just like run-of-the-mill military units. These are real, generally elite soldiers. Valentinian also was a Nicene Christian, according to one Sozomen. Now, many of the people who appointed Valentinian as emperor wanted him to also choose an imperial colleague. It's done for a couple of reasons. One, because the Romans were kind of just in this system of having a Western emperor and an Eastern emperor. So, Valentinian rules one half, he's got to have somebody rule another half. And then also because they had just had several emperors who died pretty young. Julian was, I believe, not past 35 maybe when he died. He didn't rule for, especially, I know he was 29 when he ascends to the throne. And I want to say he rules for 6 or 7 years, so he may have just been like 36 or 37 when he dies. I didn't look at that specifically, but he has a short reign and he dies young. And then Jovian, of course, only has 8 months or so, and doesn't even make it to sit on the imperial throne. So there is this notion of we need some security in case something happens here. We don't want to have to go through the process of selecting another candidate if kind of giving things away here. If Valentinian dies, then his imperial colleague can then select his next imperial colleague, and it's a more stable situation. Well, so Valentinian chooses his brother Valens as his imperial colleague to the chagrin of some. Valens, as we'll talk about here, doesn't exactly have a real stellar resume going on here. Not that it's bad, it's just there's not a whole lot there. It's Valentinian seems to have picked him more on the trust of him being his brother than any sort of credentials, which, although, there's something to be said for having an imperial colleague who you trust, because, people are constantly forming conspiracies against emperors, and it's not exact. You want to have people who you can trust around you, even if the person's on the other side of the empire. You still need to have people around who you can trust, and clearly Valentinian trusted his brother. Now, Warren Treadgold describes Valens as inexperienced, but that he soon showed some competencies. Although in the future we'll see, in writing, as I researched this lecture and I wrote out the notes for this, I take kind of a very critical stance on Valens. But as I was rereading this before I started recording, and as I'm thinking about this more, I don't know if I'm being a little too harsh on Valens. Some of these situations he's in seem to be a lot of things seem to be kind of out of his control, or he's operating on the presumption, or he's operating based on the best available information, which, although as we'll see, we'll talk more about this as we get into this, even though it's bad information, it's the best information he has going at the time. Okay, and again, Warren Treadgold, as I mentioned here, I'm using his Concise History of Byzantium as one of my resources for this project. Warren Treadgold is a professor of Byzantine history at St. Louis University, which is also where Thomas Madden, the medievalist who specializes in the Crusades, is. So you've got two real heavyweights out there at St. Louis University if you're looking to study medieval or Byzantine history. And I do want to issue a bit of I guess you could say it's an apology on this, just kind of here for a moment as we talk about sourcing in books. First couple of episodes, first couple of lectures that I've done here, I'd say episodes like 1, 2, 3, maybe even more than that. I was using John Julius Norwich's 2-volume work on the Byzantine Emperor. And so the issue with that is that John Julius Norwich is not a historian. He's a journalist. And while I don't want to, I'm sure his book was well researched and all this, I don't mean to, cast aspersions on him. But he's not a historian, right? He doesn't deal with history and sourcing and all of this for a living. And I want to bring you guys really the most reputable, the highest quality information. And, if you were taking this class in college, your professor would not assign you a book by a journalist for a reading list for a class. You're really only operating with the sources of credible, trained historians. So again, I'm not trying to say that John Julius Norwich didn't know what he was talking about, or that he's a bum or something. But for purposes of this show and for this series, I want to only bring you the best available information from the best historians who work with this stuff and know it better than anybody else. And so, we're as we go, we've got more books coming. I mean, I have, for example, Peter Heather, or maybe it's Heather, his book, The Fall of the Roman Empire, A New History of Rome and Barbarians, which we'll be using a lot coming up here. It's a good book. And he was also in the History Channel documentary series on the barbarians back. I've watched the episode on the Goths in preparation for this, and which was really fun for me because I watched that series growing up, and you could probably figure out how old I am, or roughly how old I am, just from my saying this. But going back onto History Vault, which History.com kind of has their own streaming service for all of their old documentaries, back when History Channel actually did documentaries and not like Ice Road Truckers and I don't even know what else is on History anymore. I don't watch it. But back in the day, I think the series, I might have said this, the series came out in 2004, that a really good documentary series on a number of these barbarian tribes that we're going to be encountering soon here. The Goths, which again, I watched that documentary in preparation for this, and Peter Heather, whose book I'm reading, is in that documentary series. There's also one on the Huns, which I watched recently in preparation for future episodes, and they have them on the Vandals as well, and I think either the Franks, and I think there's also one on the Saxons. Who we'll talk? We won't talk a lot about the Saxons because it's just not relevant. I do eventually want to get this more back Oriental focused. We are going to have to do some stuff here more Western focused, but as time goes on, it's going to have to become more Eastern focused because, again, this is Eastern Roman Empire themed series. But anyways, that was a bit of a tangent. Back to the real matter here. So Valens served as a member of the Protectores Domestici, which is a fairly elite military unit. Now, he was not a commander of a unit. He wasn't really an officer. He seems to have been just a soldier within the unit, which is it's not bad. I'm not saying it's bad, but not quite the same as being an officer in one of those units. Valens did manage to fight off a challenge from a guy named Procopius, who I believe was Julian the Apostate's cousin. And Procopius survived the failed invasion of the Persian Empire, and so he attempts to unseat Valens there in the east. Valens sits in Constantinople as the Eastern Emperor, and then Valentinian sits in Mediolanum as the Western Emperor. By this point in time, the seat of power in the West has moved away from Rome and is now at Mediolanum, which is present-day Milan, and eventually will also move to Ravenna, which is near Venice, but it's not the same city. Which I find interesting because of the two brothers here, Valentinian seems to be kind of the higher rated, higher viewed better, kind of the superior of the two brothers, right? And he chooses to be in the West, which is, even at this point in time, the weaker of the two sides of the empire. So I just find that interesting. I'm not really sure why Valentinian decides to go to the West and why Valens is in the East, which is the more important, the stronger side of the empire. If Valentinian was the guy who was chosen, I mean, they could have, when the new emperor was selected, they could have selected Valens, but they didn't. They chose Valentinian. So not sure why that happened, but just an interesting note. Valens also fights off some issues with the Goths along the Danube River issue there, which is a little ironic when you consider what happens in the future. And then he also reasserts Roman control over Armenia, which is an important Christian ally of the Romans against the Persians. Armenia was the first, if I'm remembering this correctly, the first country to officially declare itself a Christian country was Armenia. And still to this day, Armenians are mostly Christian. And that the Armenians were an important ally for the Romans fighting against the Persians, because again, up until really a couple of years after Valens and Valentinian ascend to the throne, the Persians are the greater threat to the Roman Empire. As we're going to, really, it's only in the time period that we're about to enter where the Persian front becomes far less important than what's going on the northern fronts for the empire, along the Danube and the Rhine rivers, as we'll see here. Treadgold also says that the two brothers attempted to reduce the bloat of the imperial bureaucracy, fight corruption, and make up for lost revenue. Part of their plan was to reconfiscate a number of pagan temples, which had been reinstated under Julian the Apostate, again because he was pagan, and use that land to add to the imperial revenue, basically. Valens, now we said Valentinian was a Nicene Christian, but Valens was an Arian Christian. And so another thing that Valens does is he reinstates the banishment of St. Athanasius, which Constantius II initiated years earlier. And this caused a bit of a stir with the Nicene Christian population of the Eastern Empire, which was gaining in gravitas and popularity. I'd recommend you go back and listen to our last episode where we talked about the Cappadocian Fathers, where we kind of talked about how in this point in time, Nicene Christianity is kind of in the ascent, and Arian Christianity, although it's still, like we said, still around, it was condemned at Nicaea in 325, and there's going to be another council in Constantinople in 380, which condemns Arianism a second time. So Nicene Christianity is on the ascent, and the heretical Arian Christianity is on a bit of a descent. So you can see why it would not have been a very popular move for Valens to banish a very prominent, and by this point, obviously very well known, Nicene Christian bishop. Now, Valens' real downfall is going to come with this, I guess you could call it like a resettlement policy for the Goths, or at least resettlement would be a term that we would use today to kind of describe the same situation. Now, the Goths were a Germanic barbarian tribe which had lived for many years in kind of along the western coast of the Black Sea, in what is today Ukraine and possibly even a little bit of Moldavia. The Goths have been living there for a long time. We've mentioned them a number of times, not a number, but we've mentioned them before on this show. And the Romans at times had fought with them and had fought against them, so the Romans know who they are. And kind of characteristic, and we're going to see that, as time goes on here, you're just going to see more and more. This is going to become a recurring theme from basically this point in history up until, well through the Middle Ages, is that the Goths were run out of their native homeland by the Huns. Now, the Huns, sure, most people, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably have an idea of who the Huns are, but they were a warlike, nomadic, cavalry-based group from Central Asia. Their origins are really unknown. No one knows where the Huns came from. No one. There's some idea. There's some theories, and we'll talk more about them as we kind of. We're going to have a whole episode, possibly several episodes, on the age of migration or the migratory period, whatever you want to call it. The barbarian invasion of the Roman Empire. And the Huns, I was reading here in this book, The Fall of the Roman Empire. We can't even pin down what language family the Hunnic language was, right? So we can't pin down. So when I say language family, we don't know. It wasn't Germanic. We don't know if it was Turkic. It might have been similar to. I can't remember. It's like Finno, and then there's another word that's escaping me at the moment. But like similar to what like the Magyar. I'm not sure which one. I say Magyar. My father, who's a historian, says Magyar. But what would be the Hungarian language? Because so there's a number of reasons. For one, the Huns don't have a written language, so there's no record that they leave behind for it. And then two, we can't even. Heather talks about this in his book, is that even the names of the Huns, which we have in recorded history, either from the Romans or written Germanic sources, is that a lot of the Hunnic names we have are often Germanicized. So we aren't even seeing the Hunnic names in their true form. It's like like Joseph is the English version of Giuseppe, right? You take a name and you kind of give it a different linguistic twist, because like for the first people to encounter the Huns would have been the Goths, who spoke a Germanic language, so they would have written in their sources the Hunnic names with a Germanic kind of twist to it. So we can't even identify from common Hunnic names what language group they would have come from. My guess, I I would lean towards they're probably a Turkic people, but there's really no way to know for sure. It's a great mystery of history. And a lot of, this is going to be a common theme of Germanic tribes being disrupted either through, climate change is a big thing that people talk about now that forced the Germanic tribes to move further south towards Roman borders. Obviously, the Huns and other Central Asian nomads coming across the Eurasian steppe, which again, you're going to have, with that, you're going to have the Huns, but then there's going to be the Avars, the Magyars, the Bulgars, the Mongols, the Timurids, the Turks. It's going to be a whole number of Central Asian groups that just kind of follow one after another, and really give Western civilization a hard go of it. And it's really not going to be until, the 1500s when that's, well, not even really that, because the Ottomans as well, or Turkic, although they didn't start in Central Asia and then storm through what was at the time of the Islamic world. But the last wave that really hits either the Islamic world or Christendom would really be the Timurids. So you can kind of get an idea of how long something like this is going to go on for, and just like I said, especially when you're like me and you study late antique and medieval history, this happening all the time. These Central Asian groups that kind of come out of nowhere and really are exceptional warriors, exceptional horsemen, and give the Western world fits for hundreds and hundreds of years. So the Goths, again, their homeland would have been in like Western Ukraine, have now been run out of their homeland, and they've been chased by the Huns down south, and now they're at the Danube, which is, again, the border between Rome and kind of the non-Roman world, right? And so the Goths kind of get this idea that they want to cross the Danube into Roman territory as essentially refugees fleeing the Huns. And so they send emissaries across the Danube River to go talk to the Emperor Valens, which they actually, and again, reading this out of Heather's book, the Emperor Valens was actually in Antioch at this time, which is in Syria. And so the Gothic representatives had to go all the way from the Danube River, travel through basically half the Roman Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire, down to Syria to meet with Valens. But they get there, they meet with him, and they do come to a deal where the Goths will come across the Danube River, settle in Roman territory. A lot of the European part of the Eastern Roman Empire is kind of vacant. Not to say that there's no one there and that it's not like productive, but it's really not the moneymaker of the Eastern Empire. That's more the Asian and Egyptian provinces. And so from the Romans' perspective, there's a number of benefits to this. So first of all, you get a new one of the parts of the deal is that the Goths offer a number of their men as soldiers. So this is a good source of new troops for the Romans, which is never a bad thing. You can settle them in an uncultivated area of the empire, and so as that land gets cultivated, it produces revenue, which means you get more tax income. So you get a guarantee of soldiers and additional revenue for the empire, which is never a bad thing. And so on its face, this looks like a good deal. And Valens even promises the Goths to provide them with supplies to make their transition to their new homes easier, right? Food for the journey, clothing, that sort of thing. And this was fairly common with the Romans. This didn't just happen with the Goths. There were other instances of barbarian, and not whole tribes, but perhaps, families or certain smaller groups within a tribe. The Romans would resettle them in a vacant part of the empire and do this, set them up with farms so they can cultivate the land, produce revenue, obligation of military service from a certain amount of the men in the group. Oftentimes, this kind of deal worked out for the Romans quite well. However, did not work out very well in this instance. So unfortunately, after the Goths cross the Danube River, their aid never comes. The immediate blame lays on two local commanders whose names were Lupicinus and Maximus. They seem to have withheld the supplies from the Goths, which they were supposed to receive. Part of me does want to blame Valens a bit for this because, he's the emperor, the buck stops with him, but he was still in Antioch at this point in time. And for even information to reach him from the Danube that something was going wrong with the Gothic resettlement would have taken a long time, and then for him to even respond to any of that. Like I said, I'm kind of having a bit of a double take here where I'm like, I shouldn't be as harsh on Valens as I initially was going to. But there's no doubt this situation went south real bad, real fast. And Valens has to carry some blame in this because, again, he's the emperor. And the Goths experienced nothing but hardships throughout this whole time. And even at one point, they're starving to the point where the Goths sell their children into slavery in exchange for dogs so they can eat the dogs. I mean, that is how desperate and how bad their situation was. They were selling their own children as slaves, not even in exchange for beef, not in exchange for something cheaper like pork. They're literally trading their children into slavery in exchange for dogs so they can eat the dogs. I mean, it was an awful situation. That this could not have gone worse for either the Romans or the Goths, as we'll get into right here. So, at one point in time, the Romans marched the Goths to this city called Adrianople, which was on the Black Sea coast. And the idea was that the Goths would be able to resupply in the markets of Adrianople, get the food that they were supposed to get the other supplies they were supposed to get. However, the garrison of Adrianople does not allow the Goths in. They're locked out of the city. And it is at this point that they just snap. They're done. They're like, this could not get any worse, and they need food. I mean, goodness, these people are really in a terrible situation. And so their leader, the Gothic leader, who's a guy named Fritigern, who led the Goths away from fleeing the Huns down to the Danube, across the river. He's been their leader for a while at this point. The Goths under Fritigern take up an attack on the garrison of Adrianople, and they actually managed to storm into the town. The garrison could not hold back against them, and the Goths sacked the city. And now after the sack of Adrianople, the Goths are free to roam through Thrace, and they're just raiding as they go. Basically, we tried playing nice with you guys. We tried to be conciliatory. That didn't work. So you don't like that? We'll try this, right? And so this requires now Valens to lead an army against this new Gothic barbarian enemy. Now Valens does put out a call for reinforcements. His new imperial colleague and nephew, Gratian, because by this point Valentinian is dead, and so Valentinian's son is Gratian, who's the new Western emperor. But Valens puts out a call for him to bring reinforcements, and Gratian will bring reinforcements. He is a bit delayed, though, with another conflict with the Alemanni along the northern border. As I said, conflict with the Alemanni along the border is just going to be reoccurring over the years as we go here. Now, as Valens approaches Adrianople, which is a town actually not too far from Constantinople, if you look at it on a map, it's really not far apart at all. Valens receives some faulty intelligence, which led him to believe that the Goths had significantly less numbers than they did. It seems that Valens is under the impression that there's about 10,000 Goths. However, they number probably closer to 20,000. So his impression is that they have half as many men as they actually do, which is going to be very, very bad for him, as we're about to see. So when Valens hears that the Goths only number about 10,000, he basically forsakes his reinforcements and marches straight on into battle. He does not wait for Gratian to arrive from the west, and he had other reinforcements that were coming from other parts of the east. He figures there's only 10,000 of them, I can take them on by myself. Now, we also need to keep in mind, kind of before we get into the battle here, that the Gothic army which Valens is about to face is not your typical Rome versus barbarian fight. Okay. Now, over the years, the Romans, when they've been fighting the barbarians, and when I say barbarians, I'm referring to the Celts and different Germanic groups. Right. The Romans would have seen everybody who was not Roman as barbarian. Right. The Carthaginians, even though we today would view the Carthaginians as more civilized than like the various Gallic tribes. The Romans viewed anyone who was not Roman as barbarians. So Carthaginians are barbarians, Persians are barbarians, the Greeks are barbarians, the kind of Greco-Egyptians of like Cleopatra would have been barbaric, right? But what I'm talking about here is Rome versus Celtic and Germanic barbarians. And so over the years, there are really two aspects about the Roman military that gave them an advantage over barbarian enemies. One was their the discipline and the order which their armies had. Right, they're very well organized, fought in very organized formations, whereas the barbarians were a bit more haphazard in their approach to battle and their battle formations. The second one was the Romans' military technology. So the Romans wore better armor than the barbarians. They had better shields than the barbarians. They had better swords, and the Romans also used the pilum, right, the javelin, which they threw before charging into battle. Now, in the later days of the empire, they have the plumbata dart, right? But the Goths are coming into, or I should say, barbarians generally are coming into battle, not as well armored, not as well prepared, not as well disciplined. And so this gives the Romans a serious. This is why the Romans were able. That's why Caesar was able to fight through all the Gauls, all the tribes in Gaul, the various tribes in Gaul. This is why they're able to conquer the Britons, and they did have some success against the Germans. Obviously, the Teutoburg Forest was a disaster, but it was only one battle in centuries of conflict. But the Goths are not like this. The Goths are different at this point in time. And especially, you have to consider that they've been raiding through Roman territory leading up to the battle here. So they are probably, as they raid through these Roman towns, taking Roman soldiers' armor, shields, swords, etc. So coming into this battle, the Romans do not have that advantage of better weapons, better armor, and the like. You also have to keep in mind the Goths are also not starving at this point in time. Okay, initially when they came into the empire and before the sack of Adrianople, right, they're starving. They're selling their children in exchange for dogs so they can eat dogs. But after raiding through what we would call the region of Thrace, is modern Bulgaria, basically, the Goths are well fed, so they have equal armor and weapons to the Romans. They're well fed, and let's keep this in mind too. They're pissed off, right? They've just been severely mistreated by the Romans, and they cannot wait to get in the battle and get their hands on those damn Romans and show them what they think about them, right? The Goths are real jazzed up for this fight. And so these are the things that you need to consider as to part of why the battle is going to go the way that it does, right? And I should, it's easy to be critical of Valens, kind of going headlong into this battle. But again, your intelligence is your intelligence. I mean, how is he supposed to? I guess you could say, how is he supposed to know that the Goths had double the men, then I guess really you'd have to have your spies executed because they gave you such terrible information. I mean, you could very well make the argument that had Valens waited for Gratian to show up and his other eastern reinforcements to show up, the battle would not have been. I don't really think this happened over 1,000 years ago. I don't think I'm spoiling anything here. It's a disastrous Roman defeat. But I mean, certainly you'd think if he waited at least for Gratian to show up, it probably goes in favor of the Romans. But so the start of the battle actually goes in the Romans' favor. However, it does seem that Valens at one point got a little too ambitious and pushed a little too far forward because he thought he could finish it off right there. And what happens is the tide of battle turns when on the Roman right flank, a heavy Gothic cavalry charge rolls up that flank. And so now the Romans lose their discipline in their lines. They basically become squished together. And so they can't maneuver. And this causes basically a panic. Not unlike what happened to the Romans at the Battle of Cannae against the Carthaginians, right? They kind of get encircled, they're squished together, they can't move, and they're just, it must have been terrifying just waiting to get hacked down. You see the 10 guys in front of you get hacked down, and it's like, well, you're just waiting until it's your turn to get killed, basically, and you can't turn around and run anywhere because you're squished with all of these other guys around you, right? So this completely breaks the Roman morale, and it was only a matter of time before thousands of men meet their fate. Roughly 2/3 of the Roman army dies at the Battle of Adrianople, including Valens himself. Now let's keep in mind that it wasn't that long ago that the Romans have their disastrous campaign against the Persians. So this is like back-to-back military embarrassments for the empire. And not to mention, I mean, losing 2/3 of the army, I've mentioned this before, but, veteran, elite soldiers in these days are not easily replaceable. It takes years and years and years of training and fighting for these soldiers to get to the point where they are like a grizzled veteran, and you can't just replace that. Surely you can train replacements in 6 months, a year, or whatever, but you can't replace the 10 years of experience. You can't replace the however many years these guys have been around. You can't just turn around and in a year recover from this sort of thing, and especially with having two instances, and now the Romans didn't lose this many men when they invaded the Persian Empire, but still, I mean, losses for sure. This is not setting the Romans up for success in the future. I think this is a part of the historiography that I think gets ignored a bit. Is you cannot replace that many guys. You cannot replace that many soldiers that easily, especially guys who are going to be serving with the emperor. They're not going to be green recruits. These are going to be veteran guys. These are going to be elite units. It's hard for the average person who just kind of sits down for this in a history class to even those of us who really study this. I think it's very hard for us to understand how serious loss that is, and how difficult it is to replace highly trained soldiers like that. Yeah, and this is the Roman Empire's greatest military disaster. Initially, when I wrote this, I said since the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. However, as I researched this further, I found that in between then and this point, there was also the Battle of Edessa in 260 AD. Now, you might remember in the first episode we talked about the crisis of the 3rd century. Well, in 260 AD, the Romans fight the Persians at the Battle of Edessa, lose, and the Emperor Valerian is actually captured by the Persians. That, if I'm remembering correctly, that was the only time a Roman emperor was ever captured by a foreign power. So that was a disaster as well, just like this was a disaster for the Romans. Now, fortunately for the Romans, the Goths were not able to take the town of Adrianople itself. This is brought to us by the historian and soldier Ammianus Marcellinus. However, the Romans have a real problem on their hands. They couldn't muster enough forces and power to eliminate the Goths permanently, but the Goths also lacked the power to be anything more than a raiding threat to the empire at this point in time. The Goths do not have, the capabilities of now, okay, they just won to Adrianople, now they're going to march on Constantinople and take the Eastern Roman capital. That's not in the cards right now. They don't have the ability to do that. However, in the future, they are going to get to the point where they can take major Roman cities. But for this point in time, it's this weird situation where the Romans they don't really have the power to get rid of these people, but they're still just kind of hanging around in like what we would now call the Balkans. They're trying to figure out what to do with them. Now, a future emperor, Theodosius, who we'll talk about in future episodes, does manage to settle the Goths down, settles them in land which was promised to them, gets them their supplies, does work out sort of alliance with them. The Goths do fight with the Romans for some time, but the Goths never fully assimilate. Now, obviously, you might have some individual Goths who might fully assimilate into Roman society, but the Goths as a kind of ethnic group never fully become one with the Roman Empire. And ultimately, as we know, the Goths in the future will be the people who greatly contribute to the downfall of the empire in the West. And so that is all we have for this episode. If you've made it this far in the video on YouTube, please give us a thumbs up. Always appreciate that. You can also find us, there's an Instagram page for the show. It is called, if you search on Instagram, academics_95, and that's spelled ACADEMIX_95. That is the Instagram page for the show where I post updates when episodes are uploaded, and I'll also post, like funny history memes, like Byzantine and medieval history memes. It's just fun, something you do when you're, kind of in this space of producing history content, trying to build an online presence and all that sort of thing. The YouTube channel it's called Professor Wren. That's the name of the YouTube channel. Although the series is called Saturdays for the Byzantines. If you search that, it does come up. But part of the reason I'm not naming the channel after the series right now is because, of course, I have ideas for future podcast lecture series that I want to bring to you, and I don't necessarily want to create new accounts for each of those. I'd rather have them all set up through one account. So I gave it the title of Professor Wren, and perhaps if this endeavor becomes fairly successful for me, I'll start using my real name. Good for public notoriety and that sort of thing. But if you are watching us on YouTube and you've made it this far, again, hit like, subscribe, ring the notification bell so you never miss another episode. Give us a 5-star review and a subscribe on Apple Podcasts. Give us a follow on Spotify. Follow us as well on Google Play. And so that's all I've got for this episode, and we'll see y'all next time.